But we are here tonight to kick off this book club and start talking about this lovely text right here, the beginning of politics, power in the biblical book of Samuel, which is going to be our main topic of conversation tonight. So by way of sort of introducing ourselves to this book, there's a few things that I wanted to do tonight. One is to sort of outline the biblical texts that this book touches on, because they are not necessarily biblical texts that we would have a lot of familiarity with or spend a lot of time with, because they're not texts in the Torah, they're texts later in the Tanakh. So I want to kind of just give a general outline of some of those texts so that you have a general lay of the land for when we dive into here. Because this sort of assumes that you know some of the major narrative elements of those texts, and it can be helpful to have an outline. Next, I want to spend a little bit of time looking more particularly at just a few passages, both in and out of the Torah, that talk about where the monarchy comes from. This is very much a text about the monarchy, centered on these very early stages in the Judean monarchy with Saul and then David, and then it speaks briefly about the succession from David to his son Solomon. So it's very focused on the monarchy, very focused on how they wield power, how this power is wielded, especially in violent ways. And the text primarily concerns itself with analyzing the way that power is used and sort of the dysfunction and the immorality that often comes along with wielding of political power. And at the end, I'll just very quickly go over what I think are the three main arguments the text is making, so that when you come along them in the actual book, you're not surprised. You know, oh, this is exactly what I'm looking for. They're starting to talk about one of the major points. And then if any point in my rambling you have a question or anything, feel free to ask. We can stop and address that. I just want to give you a little bit of information right off the bat so that you get as much enjoyment out of this text as hopefully I did. I've already read it twice now, and I loved it a lot. I also love these particular books in the Tanakh too. So I had hot chocolate curled up on my bed and was reading, chugging away quite happily. So first, right off the bat, let's talk a little bit about where these books are. One of the handouts that you should have is a handout of the classical three divisions of the Tanakh here, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, with a breakdown of the books in that text. You're probably familiar with the books in the Torah just because every year, since forever, we have read all the texts in the Torah as part of liturgical practice. We get through them every year, the same 5 books, and that's very important. The pro of that, obviously, is that we become very familiar with the very foundational and very beautiful story in there about the creation of the world, about God's covenant relationship with human beings, and about eventually moving into the Promised Land, which is all essential for Jewish identity and theology. The downside of focusing so intensely on the Torah is that we have a little bit less familiarity and knowledge with the rest of the texts in the Tanakh. And there are 39 books in the Tanakh by most conventional counting, so focusing on 5 obviously leaves out quite a few. If you look at this next major section, the Nevi'im, the Prophets, our book is going to primarily concern itself with the events of Samuel and Kings. Samuel is often divided in most modern translations into 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then the text will also go a short way into 1st Kings. Kings is also divided into 1st and 2nd Kings. There will be periodic reflections on some stuff that happens in Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges, but it's primarily concerned with just these first few books in there. And these texts between Deuteronomy and Kings are usually called the former prophets, or the Deuteronomistic history, if you want a fancy word that you can throw out at cocktail parties, the Deuteronomistic history. And they're called the Deuteronomistic history because beginning with Deuteronomy, we get a very strong singular voice that sort of continues through these next texts. So in terms of the authorship of these texts, whoever wrote Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel and Kings, it's either the same person or it's a person with a few people with very similar ideas about God's role in history, about the purpose of the Jewish people. They're either very aligned in ideology or it's the same person. So these texts have a very strong relationship with one another. Yeah.
Therefore, does it sound a lot like Moses?
No, it sounds a lot like some of the things that Moses says in Deuteronomy. Yeah. In fact, there's some very specific sorts of phrases that Moses will use in Deuteronomy that later kings and stuff will use as though they are quoting him.
Well, Deuteronomy is supposed to be the words of Moses before he dies.
Yeah, but sorry. Some of the, especially some of the religious perspectives in Deuteronomy, are so strongly related to what happens later in Samuel and Kings. Deuteronomy expresses a really strong preference for the centralization of worship, for the concentration of the power of the priesthood, and these are ideas that sort of resurge later in Samuel and also into the Kings quite a bit. So there's some reason to see these texts as very connected. Even though Deuteronomy is the last book of the Torah, and even though it goes on then to the Nevi'im, there's that strand that connects all these texts. So scholars will sometimes refer to Deuteronomy through Kings as the Deuteronomistic history to pay respect to that connection.
You also have to remember that at this time there was no Jerusalem set up as a center.
Right.
And so the worships are, so where was the center of worship at? Shiloh was mentioned, Shiloh?
Yeah. There's going to be a number of important sites, but it's going to be wherever the tabernacle is.
Right.
And the tabernacle is going to be towed around by David will bring it around back and forth a little bit. Samuel will bring it around back
and there
and
were
forth.
still the three holidays that, the traveling holidays.
Yeah, the degree to which people actually practice that pre-temple is a bit ambiguous. It's a little bit more difficult to make pilgrimage to somewhere when
You don't know where the somewhere is.
So it's hard to plan your calendar around that. That probably would have been practiced more once the temple is built by Solomon, and you can say next year in Jerusalem rather than next year in I don't know yet. Maybe they'll mail us.
That's why we're wandering. That's why we're wandering Jews. We're wandering around until we find.
They're trying to find that's exactly right. We're supposed to be here somewhere around here, but we don't know. So very briefly, one of the handouts that you got should be just a very quick and dirty summary of some of these texts right here. And I won't bother you to read them off the sheet. You have this here available to you. You can take it with you and refer to it. If the book says like, and such happened in Judges, you can refer to this very quickly and just say, oh, these are some of the major events in the book of Judges. But we don't actually need to read through there for you to get a sense of that. I do want to just say a couple things about Joshua and Judges in particular, though. So the book of Deuteronomy ends, obviously, with the death of Moses and the transition of the authority to lead the people of Israel to his successor, Joshua. Right? The book of Joshua, which immediately follows this, is a story of the conquest of the land of Canaan. Right? The people of Israel leave Egypt. They are promised this land flowing with milk and honey. They get there, and unfortunately there are already people there. So what do you do about the people that are already here? Well, holy war is what you do about the people who are already there. And you either kill them or convert them, or you drive them off. And this is basically what is described in the book of Joshua. Joshua also paints a sort of hyperbolically successful campaign. I mean, Joshua depicts a perfect conquest of the land of Canaan, with every single tribe, every single foreign king is subjugated to Israel's power and authority. This is a very sort of pietistic reading of history. This almost certainly did not happen exactly as it is described. And in fact, as soon as you finish the book of Joshua and turn the page to the book of Judges, you see that immediately there are all these people left unconquered who are causing problems for the people of Israel. So the picture painted for us in the book of Joshua is a rosy picture. The other important thing that happens in the book of Joshua is that Joshua will divide up the land to each of the 12 tribes, so that each of the 12 tribes has sort of a designated region within the land of Canaan that they own and that they cultivate, and they have the responsibility for. But that will be sort of the last time for quite a long time that the 12 tribes will really be united in any sort of strong political sense. The book of Judges, which we don't pay nearly enough attention to, but is very fascinating, depicts a period of several hundred years in which Israel goes through this very painful cycle where there will be peace for a while. The people of Israel will sort of turn away from or forget God and his commandments. Some foreign king or ruler will come in and oppress the people of Israel, usually militarily enslave them. And then this will be followed by the people crying out, much like they did in Egypt. They cry out to God for salvation, for help, for assistance. Hi. Grab one of everything, some candy, a book, whatever you want.
Actually, we've only taken the other two.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
well, that's fine.
Thank you.
There you go. This vicious cycle of them being exploited and oppressed by foreign kings, crying out for God's help, God sends them a judge. Right? The book of Judges is about these 12 judge figures, the Shofetim, whose responsibility is to save the people of Israel. They're sort of empowered, almost like in a superhuman sense, by God. They're given the Spirit of the Lord, the text says. And then they lead successful revolts against these oppressors. And then peace returns to the land. And this process repeats a dozen times in the book of Judges, each with a different leader, over and over and over again.
History repeats.
Yeah, and it does in a very sort of cyclic, but also spiraling downward sort of pattern. So each time this pattern repeats, it gets worse and worse and worse. The characters involved, the Israelite characters, become more and more morally ambiguous. The oppressions that they suffer are described much more viciously. The hero, the judge himself or herself that is raised, becomes a much more difficult to understand figure, and their motivations are not necessarily totally selfless. And
Samson was not a model figure, and he was the last of the judges, and
by the time we get to Samson, right, we've seen sort of a complete breakdown of these leadership figures. Samson is a judge.
Here you have a guy you wouldn't want him to be a model for your children.
That's right. He's not a particularly good guy, and it only gets worse from there. I mean, there's still several chapters left after Samson. Some of the most terrifying passages in the Tanakh are in the book of Judges. Terrible things. There's instances of horrific sexual violence, war, just butchery of people. It's some pretty graphic stuff, and it's every time this cycle repeats, again getting worse and worse. Towards the end of the book of Judges, you see this refrain pop up over and over again. And it says, many of the chapters towards the end of the book of Judges begin in this way. It'll say, in that day there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. So chapter 17 begins this way, 18, 19, 22. Many of the chapters begin in this way, sort of tipping you off to this is chaos that results from a lack of strong centralized leadership. And that sort of foreshadows then what happens as we get to the book of Samuel, which is this desire for kingship. And it comes out of this experience in the book of Judges where it's just chaos all over the place.
Well, that would be a normal desire then, wouldn't it? That would be a normal desire to have one central...
Yeah.
You know.
Right. Well, it's born out of this very specific context. It's to address this specific problem that they have been recurringly facing.
Yet in the book of Samuel, it's like, God doesn't want them to have a king.
That's right. And we'll take a special look at that passage in particular in just a moment. Judges ends almost with the destruction, the outright annihilation of one of the 12 tribes. So far down has the situation sort of devolved that the tribe of Benjamin is almost wiped out entirely in a civil war. So much so that in a rather sad story, women are captured to forcibly repopulate the tribe because all the men are dead. So this is sort of the note that Judges ends on. and one of the reasons why, one of the powerful underlying motivations for a desire for kingship. The people think that it will address this problem.
Well, the tribes didn't help each other.
Right. Again, they're very divided. The best you could get is maybe 3 or 4 of them working together at a time. When the prophetess Deborah is raised up to fight off Canaanites, you can only get 4 or 5 of them to come along with her. Same thing for Gideon. Same thing for several of these other judge figures who have to fight battles. They can only get a couple tribes on the east side, or a couple tribes on the northern end, or a couple of the southern tribes together. Nobody wants to cooperate all 12 together. A sense of unified identity amongst all 12 tribes is completely absent during this
That
period.
almost follows through the Greek city-states
Yeah.
later on in history.
Yeah, it is very much like that. I mean, you have a few powerful capital cities, and they are really the centers of power, and not much shared identity between them. The northern tribes think of themselves as very distinct from the southern tribes. They think of themselves as very distinct from the eastern tribes, etc. So that's sort of the stage that this book is then going to enter into and begin to talk about the kingship, the monarchy. Just to give you a little bit more, once we get into this text, doesn't cover much of the kings, 1st and 2nd Kings. Solomon's reign begins in 1st Kings, and so that will be mentioned. But the rest of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, are very interesting because they depict several hundred years of history. Right? Between Samuel and the 1st King, you only get the first 3 kings of Israel. All the rest, and there are dozens, are in the latter parts of 1st Kings and 2nd Kings. And this story is very important because it shows it shows the lead up to one of the most significant events in Jewish history, and that's the captivity in Babylon. So towards the middle of 2nd Kings, the Assyrian Empire comes in and completely annihilates the northern tribes and their centers of power, and those people flee south. And it's really only through this strange act of divine intervention that Jerusalem is preserved. God sends an angel to literally murder 200,000 Assyrian soldiers that have camped outside the walls of Jerusalem. It's a rather fantastical sort of description of how this army is repelled. But that only temporarily puts off this sort of foreshadowed destruction of Jerusalem, and just a couple generations later, Babylon will come in and finish what Assyria started and take the people of Jerusalem captive, hauling off most of their wealthy and upper-class elites and leaving the rest of the people in poverty and squalor under heavy taxation. And that element of the story, being carted off to Babylon, as historically traumatizing as it is, was also an enormously creative period for Jewish theology. And it's out of this, the experience of this event, that many of these later texts, Jeremiah and Ezekiel especially, and the latter parts of Isaiah, were written in response to. How do you explain God's presence in this terrible suffering? Texts which I think in many ways continue to still be applicable today because Jews continue to suffer today. So those questions have not gone away. And so I think the words of the prophets writing during a similar period continue to have their power also, because they're addressing questions that are still very contemporaneous. So that was just to give you sort of a picture. That's what this is all about, these next few books, this very important period in Israelite and also Jewish history. If you have a Bible on you, great. If you don't, that's fine also. There are just a couple texts that I want to look at very quickly that have to do with the monarchy. And the first is Devarim or Deuteronomy chapter 17. The latter part of chapter 17 here, beginning in verse 14.
Would it be helpful if I grab some from the sanctuary, or do you not think we need that?
Probably not. I mean, I'm going to read. It's just a few verses here. I can read it. This is this passage that I'm going to read here is sort of strange in that it's so prescient. It knows exactly what's going to happen, and because it knows exactly what's going to happen, Scholars have often read this as being inserted much later than the surrounding text, which seems to have very little to do with what's going on here. Sort of among these instructions about how to carry out festivals and how to delegate power to judges and stuff, this passage interrupts all of a sudden, not only with the assumption that the people will go into the land, successfully conquer it, but then at some point people are going to come to whoever's in charge and demand a king, which is exactly what does in fact
Sentence
end up
14.
happening. Sorry, what?
Sentence 14 you're talking about?
Deuteronomy 17.
Yeah, but in there,
Oh yeah, verse 14. Yeah. So these are Moses' instruction to the people of Israel. He's telling them about something that will come to happen later. And he says here, if after you have entered the land that your Lord your God has assigned to you and taken possession of it and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God. Be sure to set a king over yourself, one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you who is not one of your kinsmen. Moreover, he shall not keep many horses, or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses. Since the Lord has warned you, you must not go back that way again. And he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray, nor shall he amass silver and gold in excess. When he is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching, the Torah, written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. Let it remain with him, and let him read it in all his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, to observe faithfully every word of this Torah, as well as these laws. Thus he will not act haughtily toward his fellows, or deviate from the instruction to the left or to the right, to the end that he and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. So, when you get there, you're going to want a king. When you have a king, that's okay. Pick one. It's got to be one of your people, not somebody else. They shouldn't get greedy, right? There are limitations on the sort of wealth that they can accumulate. And if you're going to have this king, he should be very studied in the Torah. Now, this is weird, because at this point, within the context of the story, there's no particular reason to look forward to having a king. Why would you even discuss that? Moses is not a king. Moses has not initiated transition of power like a king. He's chosen Joshua, not one of his descendants, not a Levitical priest, just another person whose only real credit is that he was very enthusiastic about and thought that they would be successful if they invaded the land of Canaan. He was one of the spies that was sent in, but otherwise has very little, no quality that you might elect him as leader. So this passage kind of comes out of nowhere. But it says a number of important things about what this author thought would be appropriate for a king. One, right off the bat, it says that the people will ask for a king in order to be like other nations who are around them. This is almost always bad. You never want to be like the other nations that are around you. Many of the commandments that are given throughout Leviticus and Numbers are specifically addressed to the people of Israel so that they will not be like the other nations who are around them. Many of the food laws about commerce, laws about sexuality, tons of laws about inheritance, how you treat your slaves. The text will specifically say you do this because you are not like them. So right away we should question the motivation of the people who say we should do this because we want to be like everybody else. Another thing that this passage does it sort of immediately punts on the idea that God will be the one who chooses this person, right? So in verse 15, you shall be free to set a king, one chosen by the Lord. Be sure to set one over yourself of your own people. Well, if it's chosen of the Lord, then there's no particular reason to then have this additional addendum, make sure you choose one who's your kinsman. Well, if that's important to God, then God will just make sure to choose one who's of your kinsman. So even in this original telling, there's sort of this immediate breakdown, this immediate acknowledgement that, even though God is in charge of the choice, that somebody else is going to be in charge of the choice. These limitations on wealth are super important, as we will see in a later passage when the first king is chosen, but just keep those in mind in the back of your head. And then this last part right here, you are not to act haughtily towards your fellows, so that you may reign long in the midst of Israel, you and your descendants. And this is echoing something that happens or maybe foreshadowing something that happens much, much later in the middle of 2 Samuel. God comes to King David after he has established his power base, and he tells him that you or one of your descendants will sit on the throne in Jerusalem forever, unconditionally. It will happen. And this is called the Davidic Promise, or the Davidic Covenant, and it's had an enormous impact on both Jewish and later Christian theology also, who have sort of banked on this idea that eventually this coming messianic figure needs to be of the line of David because of this promise that's given to David when he has this power. So the idea that if you behave yourself, then you and your descendants can reign long here is looking forward to the giving of that promise to David. Many, many books and chapters later. So that's one important text. Are there any questions just about that short little snippet right there?
No, just that it never lasted.
No, no. This is a very idealized portrait, but it's also important because sort of in its, it reveals so much sort of in its naivete, you know. It's so innocent.
It doesn't take being human into account.
Yeah, it seems not to. And that's sort of an interesting part of it. If you have a text, go ahead and flip over to 1 Samuel chapter 8. And this is going to be the chapter that sort of sets off most of the reflections in this text, or is the foundation for many of the reflections in this text. 1 Samuel chapter 8 is where the people of Israel first come. Samuel is not only a prophet, but he is also sort of the last in the line of judges. He too, like many of the judges before him, was this charismatic figure raised up and empowered by God to address a very specific military threat and return the people of Israel to the state of peace. He had a role in the defeating of the Philistines, which was their current enemy. But he's also a prophet, and so he also has much more intimate interactions with God than a lot of other characters in the text do. But in 1 Samuel chapter 8 here, we get the people of Israel asking Samuel for a king. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 1. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons judges over Israel. The name of it... we don't need to read that part. He's got sons. That's nice. We can read this. The name of his first one was Joel, the name of his second son Abijah, and they sat as judges in Beersheba. And his sons did not follow in his ways. They were bent on gain, they accepted bribes, and they subverted justice. All the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel at Ramah. They say to him, "You have grown old, and your sons have not followed in your way. Therefore appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations." So, Samuel's sons follow after a very similar pattern of behavior that Eli's sons did. Samuel is his birth narrative is very interesting. Samuel's mother, Hannah, was not able originally to have a child, and so she promises to God that if she has a son, she will dedicate him to the service of the Lord, and that's how Samuel's born. And there's a crisis of leadership at the time that Samuel is born. Eli is the prophet, sort of in charge of things, and the same situation. His sons are sleeping with female temple attendants and taking bribes and doing all these other things. So Samuel's sort of gone the same way as this mentor figure of his in his inability to control his sons and to pass on power. Samuel is the de facto ruler of Israel at this time. Pass on power through his descendants. So the people come to him. "We want a king. Your sons are terrible. We want a king like all other nations." And again, this is almost verbatim from Deuteronomy. You know, one day this is going to happen. Oh, look, it happens right here, exactly like Moses said it would. Right. In verse 6, Samuel was displeased, as one would be, that they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord replied to Samuel, "Heed the demand of the people in everything they say to you. For it is not you that they have rejected, it is me that they have rejected as their king. Like everything else they have done ever since I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and worshiping other gods, so they are doing to you. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly, and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over them." I think this is one of the most sort of heartbreaking passages in the Bible, right? Where God sort of admits at long last, they are really rejecting me. I wanted to be their king. I wanted to be the sovereign who was in charge of them and looked after them, both as a king and as a father figure, right? Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King. That's the role that God wanted to play. And now he's sort of, he feels jilted almost that they have, they want to replace him with some human being. Right? So God sort of relents and says, okay, you can have a king under the condition that you warn them about what the practices of the king will be like. And what the practices of the king will be like is exactly the opposite of what Deuteronomy said the practices of the king should be like. So, in verse 10, Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, this will be the practice. And this word here is not practice, this is mishpat. These are the judgments. These are the rulings, the sort of official interpretations of the law that the king is going to give, his policies, if you will. These will be the policies of the king who will rule over you. And then there's a long list. He will take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and horsemen. They will serve as his outrunners of his chariots. He will appoint them as chiefs of thousands and of 50s, or they will have to plow his fields and reap his harvests and make his weapons and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will seize your best fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 part of your grain and vintage and give them to his eunuchs and courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves, your best young men, your donkeys, and he will put them to work for him. He will take 1/10 part of your flocks, and they shall become his slaves. The day will come when you will cry out because of the king whom you yourselves have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you on that day.
He's warning
Not
them.
a pretty picture.
It's not a pretty picture, no.
He's warning them.
He is warning them very solemnly as he was instructed to do. The word take here is very strong. He's going to take from you all these things. And this isn't just through taxation. I mean, this is through just also the abuse of his power. Right?
Eminent domain.
Yeah, he is going to accumulate for himself all this wealth, all this power, all this military might for himself, And then the sort of punchline on the end, and this is really, it needs to be seen in the context of a reversal of what happens for the people in the Exodus experience. Remember, the people in Egypt, they cry out, and God hears them and delivers them. Over and over again in the book of Judges, the people cry out, and God hears them and delivers them. This time, they will cry out, and God will not listen. So he's telling you right now, I am done intervening to save you from the consequences of your own mistakes. That's done, if you want this to happen. And the people respond, sounds good to us. And they want a king to rule over them. Right?
Too much free will.
Yeah.
Earlier you said you may set a king over you.
Yeah.
And you said God kind of, so it was going to be the people would set a king, or man, not God.
Yeah.
So he gave that up anyway, God.
Right, and that's one of the reasons why people think it was inserted later. So as sort of this is the way that history ended up going. It would be much more convenient for us if Moses said that we could do this, right? Because it has not turned out so well for us. So that's what's sort of led people to the suspicion that perhaps it was inserted later. I don't know whether or not that's true. It is kind of strange if it was intended to be there, because it seems very permissive. Yeah, go ahead and set a king over you. That's no problem. Whereas here, just the very question grieves God deeply. I mean, he's very, as far as God tends to get emotional, this is him at sort of the height of his emotionality. He is very upset by this request, and it seems like if you had given them prior permission, that you would not be this, bent out of shape about it.
But in a way, they did need a king.
In a practical sense, yeah.
They needed one to unite the people because they were so undivided.
Yeah, there are a number of very real political concerns, right? They have lost all faith in the ability of Samuel and Samuel's children to lead them. They're probably very tired of this sort of ad hoc, charismatic figure raised up by God to save them sort of scenario. They want lasting peace, right? They probably want a kingdom that can expand a little bit, get them some wealth and some power and some security. And you can't do that when you just periodically have this guy say, I am, God has given me the strength, follow me, and I will go off and beat those people up, right? That's not an effective form of government.
Were there a bunch of tribes they were trying to pull together too at this time?
Yeah, and again, there's no I mean, when we think 12 tribes of Israel, right? And these are all the descendants of Jacob. In the text, they don't feel that way yet, anyway. They don't feel particularly united. They have spent generations growing apart from one another and not really having anything to bring them together. The monarchy is one of the first things to really try and do that. And a united monarchy lasts for a very short time. So another thing that happens in 1 Kings is that while David rules over a united monarchy, all 12 tribes under his control, and while Solomon will rule over all 12 tribes, immediately following Solomon's death, his son will lose control, and the kingdom will split in two, with 10 tribes in the north, in what comes to be called Israel, and 2 tribes in the south, which comes to be called Judah. So even a united monarchy is very short-lived, and there will be 2 parallel kingdoms for the next several hundred years. So for most of sort of Israelite history, this idea of 12 united tribes that's not a big thing, unfortunately. There's profound political and religious divisiveness the entire time, basically.
I think you have a question.
Oh yeah. Go.
I believe that there's a lot of academic suggestion that Deuteronomy was compiled during the Babylonian conquest, during the post-exilic period.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would make kind of sense that maybe the scribes were reflecting back on Moses' teachings, or maybe they had those records and they were compiling those records, because at the time the Babylonians came in, they replaced the king with a kinship, member of the family, and so, but he was still like a puppet to the Babylonian king.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting that they're reflecting back and saying, and the people weren't as forewarned because they weren't as threatened, because it was a kinship. It was like following some sort of consistent teachings with the Hebrew traditions, and then 10 years later, the temple was destroyed. So
Mm-hmm.
I could see how there was a lot of value to reflecting on those.
Yeah, I mean,
traditions.
yeah, you're very right that that is one of the sort of leading theories about when these texts were compiled. That's where they would have a lot of incentive to compile these texts as a way of preserving their cultural identity, making sure the story is really shored up so that they have a strong foundation for where their people came from. There's a pretty united sense of identity once they return from Babylon. Once they are allowed to go home, once Persia comes in and conquers Babylon and sends the people back to Jerusalem, they have a pretty worked out sense of identity then, although that's not without some friction as well. But yeah, these texts are things that people put together for a reason, often a very deeply emotional reason. They need to put them together in order to understand their present condition, even though these are texts that tell stories that happened a long time ago. So, yeah. Just one more note about the end here. When the people say, yes, we must have a king over us, in verse 20, like all the other nations, let a king rule over us, that will go at our head and fight our battles. Right, that will go at our head and fight our battles. This gives us some insight into what specifically the people wanted a king for. And that's for united military leadership, right? You need a sovereign political force who can essentially draft, or commission people into a unified professional or semi-professional army, rather than always having to call up sort of random militias of people who have never held a weapon in their life. Now you can get a trained force. Now you can accumulate enough assets and supplies in order to fund a proper military. Militaries are exorbitantly expensive in ancient times. They're expensive, and they're not cheap now either, but it would take, somebody worked out the calculations one time, that it takes taxation from roughly 8 people, 8 normal, common, everyday peasant workers, agricultural workers, to produce enough excess resources to feed one soldier, to be worth the value of one soldier. So that's a lot. That's a lot of manpower that goes into supplying an army. And if you want an army of thousands or 10,000s, and if you want chariots and weapons and all that stuff on top of that, that's an enormous concentration of wealth, the likes of which this region had not previously seen. That's really only something you get when you have somebody with the power to levy taxes and to call up troops and stuff like that. But it's also a role, again, that God had played before. Right? When the people of Israel first march into the land of Canaan, an angel appears to Joshua and says, I will go before you, I will lead your armies. And Joshua's freaked out, as one would be, and says, whose side are you on? And the angel refuses to answer him and says, I'm on no one's side. I'm from the Lord, but I'm going to lead your armies. So this role of going ahead of the armies, being the vanguard, is a role that God has claimed for himself, and a role that the people are basically replacing with this king. So another element of that sort of shoving God out of a position that they prefer to be in.
So Samuel never pretended to be a king, right?
Well, he was very king-like in terms of his authority. He did not call himself a king. A couple of the judges sort of tried to call themselves kings a little bit. Gideon and his son got very close to pronouncing themselves king. One of Gideon's sons' name was Abimelech. Avimelech. My father is king. So he tried to sort of kickstart his own monarchy after Gideon's death. But no, that Samuel was very powerful, but not a king. He had much of the authority of a king, but king has a very special sort of place in the political apparatus of Israel and Judah.
So he was more on the religious side than the secular side? Is that what you're saying?
Well, he is both. He performs both the religious function and sort of this civic and military function. He's doing both, but he doesn't lay claim to all 12 united tribes. He does not pretend to tax everyone. He does not insist that a professional army be gathered. He doesn't accumulate wealth to himself in the same way that a king later will. So, but he does lead armies and perform the religious role. And in fact, Samuel will be the last person to do that, to do both the religious function and the civil military function. After Samuel, and with the election of the first king, these two roles are going to be distinct, split between two different people, which are constantly antagonistic with each other. So Samuel is first going to appoint Saul king over Israel, and Samuel will be very antagonistic with Saul. This passage ends by saying, Samuel, you're old, you're going to die soon. Samuel does not die for another 17 chapters.
Right.
So he lingers sort of in the background, continuing to exercise a great deal of power. His farewell speech is 3 chapters later. So there's 10 chapters after his farewell speech where he's still sort of, lording over Saul and sort of criticizing him and all this stuff.
That was like Jacob.
Yeah, it's kind of creepy a little bit. But also he appoints David while Saul is still king.
Right.
He anoints him, and that leads to a great deal of what's going to be in here.
But also he supersedes Saul at one point where he yells at Saul for not killing the king of Amalek.
Yeah.
And he goes out and does it himself.
Yeah. So Samuel, not hesitating a bit to really transfer power over to Saul. He's clinging a little bit at the end of his life. He doesn't want to retire quite as much as everybody else around him wants him to retire.
What are the prerequisites you need to be a prophet like Samuel? I mean, what made him a prophet?
God's.
Are you studying?
But you have to. And the thing is,
I'm compiling a resume. I want to know.
But he had to prove it to other people, though, that God talks to him, and then they believe it.
He spoke in tongues.
Very charismatic.
I think Samuel sort
It
of.
was the personality too.
Yeah, that's part of it. The charisma is a big part of it.
Yeah.
Winning against the Philistines is an even bigger part of it. So people, just pragmatically, being able to win a battle that other people had not being able to win, even if people can't necessarily verify the religious dimension of his prophet status, who are you going to go with? I mean, he won, right? So you kind of got to follow him anyway.
He's got some cred.
Yeah, some of it is by brute force that he has sort of seized that title, and some of it is we know as readers because we see Samuel prayed to God and God said, do this, that, and the other thing.
Right.
It's as much for the reader, maybe even more so for the reader than it is for the people around him. So that hopefully will paint at least a broad picture of what we're going to be getting into as we get into this text. On the bottom of this sheet right here, the little handout, I wrote down what I take to be the three main arguments that these authors have sort of put together in this text. And it's very neatly organized, basically one argument per chapter with a nice little conclusion at the end. So the first argument is about the confusion of means and ends. The authors say that there's something about the nature of power, political power, sovereign political power, that leads people to confuse means and ends. Means, things like wealth, military force, influence, things like this that we use to achieve things, and ends, things like love and people's lives and religious piety and stuff like this that we often work towards. So sovereign power sort of confuses us to treat ends as means and to pursue means for their own sake. So power is going to be pursued for its own sake rather than as a means to securing peace. And people's lives are going to be traded as means to some other end rather than being pursued in and of themselves. So that's sort of the first argument. The second is that there's two primary, what they call faces, but really motivations for political violence. And that's insecurity and entitlement. So the author is going to analyze the way that especially Saul is a very insecure, anxious, paranoid sort of king. And that leads to him to further isolate himself from his followers and even his supporters. And that in turn encourages him to be increasingly violent. He lashes out because of this profound distrust between him and the people around him. And then the second phase of political violence is a sense of entitlement. And the author is primarily going to look at the figure of David as an example of this profound sense. David is one of the most egotistical characters in the Tanakh. For all the praise that's heaped on him, and some of that is warranted surely, if he is the author of the Psalms, he certainly had a strong religious heart and imagination, but he is a killer.
Right.
He is a killer and a thug and a warlord and a mercenary, and he will not hesitate to betray anybody in the pursuit of conquest. He is a fighter's fighter, and killing is what he does best. And he has a very strong sense of his own capabilities, and that gives him a very entitled outlook on some of his followers. There are people who are with David throughout his entire life, who he depends on very much in his clawing his way into this position of power, who he then later forsakes or betrays out of this sense of entitlement, and that leads to tragedy and more violence.
It's also a womanizer,
Yes,
big time.
David has half a dozen wives, all of which he's stolen from other men.
Right.
Almost every single one has
So
been
that's
stolen
an
away from
entitlement
someone else.
kind of a thing.
Yeah, he's married Saul's daughter. He's married Saul's wife. He steals Abigail, one of his wives, from another guy. He steals Bathsheba very famously in a rather dramatic scene from one of his most trusted elite soldiers.
Right.
Uziel? Is it Uziel? His
Uriah.
Uriah.
Yeah, Uriah.
Yeah, it started with a U.
Yeah, one of those. Yeah, Uriah, who's there's this list of David's 30 most badass soldiers and a list of all these deeds that they have accomplished. And Uriah's on that list. He's one of David's the top guys. Steals his wife. Right? All of his wives are stolen from him. He's pretty bad with that. Not as bad as Solomon, his son, but pretty bad. And then the last is that political. Oh yes.
Question. Two-part question. The
Sure.
first part is that Rabbi Wolpe wrote a book called David, like a year,
Heart of
year and a
David.
half ago.
A divided heart.
Yeah.
Yes. So my question is, for those that have read it, reading that text, would that give us any good insight and help enrich, if you will, this text that we're working on with here? Because I haven't had a chance to read it, but I'm just wondering if it'd be worth.
I haven't read it.
Well, I've read the book, but I haven't
Yeah.
read this one yet.
So-
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'll ask you.
You should
separately.
read as much about David as possible. He's a fascinating character. So if there's a good book about him, there's another one called David's Secret Demons. David's Secret Demons. It's also very good by Baruch Halpern, and walks through some of these sort of the psychological aspects of David's character. He is one of the most compelling characters in the text, and actually just by sheer net volume, outside of Moses, I think probably the character about which the most is written. Right, he gets basically 2.5 entire books. I mean, if 1 Samuel is his rise to power, 2 Samuel is his consolidation and his fall from power. Even 1 Kings is really overshadowed by his character and through his son. So that's a lot of sort of screen time dedicated to this particular character.
Plus Psalms.
Yeah, and then we get to see sort of his softer, dainty side in Psalms, where he's less killing people and more talking about how beautiful trees are.
And he's a musician.
Yeah, it helps him steal other men's wives.
Do we have any idea about the length of the terms that they had in terms of how long Saul was actually king?
Yeah,
how long David was king and Solomon?
There are notes.
There's some idea.
Such and such reigned for however many years or so. I think David was king. Saul was not king for very long.
Right, he was the shortest of the three for sure.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think David and Solomon both reigned for decades, so quite some time. And usually there are little notes, such and such died and reigned for however many years. So that's pretty good. And then the last argument I think they make here is that political violence is often executed through chains of intermediaries. You send one person to tell somebody else to have something bad done to somebody else through messengers, often a long, very sort of wandering chain of messengers. And not only does this allow you to sort of claim a degree of plausible deniability for the ultimate outcome, but it actually ends up exacerbating the violence done, because each person in the chain has some vested interest in the outcome and will tweak orders here and there or act in certain ways that will lead to perhaps much more chaos down the road than was originally intended by the commander. So there are a number of very interesting stories where the authors will sort of apply this analysis to passages where Saul orders the death of someone and dozens die instead, or where David orders the death of a particular person and literally almost brings down his kingship because as a result of it.
Well, even Uriah, he ordered somebody else to order Uriah to, so he passed on he doesn't take responsibility for it. It was the commander who ordered Uriah to do that.
Right, and I mean that's one of the examples. David orders.
Of course, Nathan got even with him.
Yes, and there's a bit of a reflection on the role on the role that Nathan plays also in that. Any questions?
Question. With regards, it's not known who was the author or potential authors of this particular book. So going with the notion, we believe that the House of David, the things happened as are in the writings and so forth. Could we say, with some degree of certainty, that whoever wrote this book was responsible for the text that we're going to be reading? Had to have been somebody obviously that was learned, understood, somebody on the inside that once you read the book, they're giving you their opinion of what they saw, and was probably somebody who got offended because of something that David did, whether it was take a wife or this, that, or whatever. And this was kind of like their way to maybe revenge or what have you, to write this in a format, but yet the literature turned out to be much more than that because of the way it was written and what it portrayed, and the glimpse or the look through the window kind of effect that it gives us now, so many thousands of years later, when the actual text was written. Could we base that, or am I too far out left field somewhere?
No, I think you're on the right track.
An insider per se.
Yeah, that is sort of the trail that we have to follow. I mean, we can never know for sure who wrote it, and many of your thoughts they will say very similar things in sort of the conclusion of this. So they say basically in the introduction, a lot of people have tried to figure it out. We're not going to try and figure it out. We're just going to talk about the story. But at the end, they sort of imagine, well, what sort of person could have written this story? And you're right, it needs to have been someone with an intimate knowledge of how these political things played out. Also somebody with a great deal of creativity to sort of fill in the gaps that nobody could know about. I mean, there are conversations between just two people in private in these passages in the Bible, and nobody could have written that down, right? So those were probably narrative flourishes of their own design. But also somebody who didn't necessarily have a stake in the outcome. because there are texts, biblical texts that are both very favorable towards David, very anti-David, very favorable towards the idea of a monarchy, very anti-monarchy. So they're not a partisan in this. They're not advocating for a particular character or for a particular position. They are a scholar. They are an analyst. They are, I think, trying to understand maybe what happened, and then using a bit of imagination to fill in the blanks.
I just want to add that the book uses the altered translation of Samuel.
I'm sorry, what?
The book uses the altered translation of Samuel.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you...
No.
And so I looked at that first.
Okay.
And that really goes into who wrote it, how many people wrote it over so many different times, so many different iterations. It's really like a web. All right, so if you're interested, I'll show it to you. We'll talk.
So,
It's cool. Yeah.
so I never realized this, but are you saying that the author of this part would be someone like a Jeff Shara, or that the guy who wrote the Pillars of Fire? I forget his name. I just read his last book.
Ken Follett.
Yeah. Who is really
I have no idea who that
writing a historical novel? Like Jeff Shara says, okay, I'm going to take all this Civil War stuff, or I'm going to take whatever, all these facts, and then I'm going to pretend I'm this general, and I'm going to research that general.
Yeah.
Then I'm going to put words in that general's mouth that I think he would have said based on my intimate knowledge of that general's writings and his diary and all that.
Maybe
Are you saying that's what this is?
Maybe more like Josephus.
There's probably an element of that there. I think the author is probably a bit closer to the events than that. They probably weren't in it, but within a generation of it, I think. And I think the authors go on to try and make that point too. Although they didn't necessarily have a vested interest in the outcome, does this turn out in favor of a king or against a king, or who wins between David and Saul, I think they had a vested interest in understanding the direction that Israel was going in. And that compelled them to write it. So I don't think it was somebody like 500 years later who studied these figures and then invented the story. I think it was somebody maybe a few decades later who sat down to try and understand what had taken place, and had maybe some direct access to some things, some a little bit more distant where they embellished a little bit.
Josephus did that with the Masada and all that.
Yeah, I mean, and this is fairly common for ancient historians to sort of gather as much information as they can, but where they can't fill in blanks, they don't leave it blank. You know, they
Fudge.
They extrapolate. You know,
Fudging.
you know, as scholars are wont to do. So some of these conversations may be more a product of the author's imagination than they are of, you know, exact historical certainty. But the broad contours of the story are probably almost certainly historical.
So do we know for a fact that these relationships are actual fact? Do we know that Jonathan and David had a homosexual relationship? I mean, do we know that? Or is somebody speculating on that?
That's not in the book.
I mean, there is very little external confirmation of basically any of these stories. We don't start getting more reliable historical and archaeological confirmation of these stories until several generations after this, and then there'll be some mentions of later kings in like Assyrian or Egyptian correspondence and stuff like that. So, like, do we have objective confirmation of whatever relationship David had with Jonathan? No. I mean, this is going to be our primary source for that. Yeah.
I was going to ask Eileen if she has a website you want to give out, that where you found that nice little web.
The name of the book is The David Story, a translation with commentary of 1 and 2 Samuel. And the book used this translation. And so he goes into, because his job is translating ancient Hebrew. So he spends like an entire introduction talking about how he did the translation. And he took parts from ancient Aramaic all the way through the Qumran scrolls in order to piece this together. So it's actually fascinating by itself. So
Thank you.
I'll give you the site. It's not a website. It's his name is Robert Alter.
How long? I know all of his books. They're all pretty long.
Appreciate it.
Holter's a good guy. We had coffee a few years ago.
Did you?
No.
No. I mean, can you imagine just
Beer.
devoting your life to ancient Hebrew text in first Aramaic, second Aramaic, third
But
Aramaic?
he does some work. He does a lot of work with the New
Amazing
Testament.
guy.
Well, what about this guy Matt who did the Kabbalah?
Yeah.
Yeah, talked about that last night.
18 years of translating.
Right. Thank
He
goodness we
created
have
an
people
entire
like that.
genre of biblical.
He had to have had a nice grant.
literary.
Hilton.
Maybe.
Hilton's the one that paid for
Hype.
it.
It's the hype.
That's about all I
That
got
helps.
for you. But I think the plan, December 7th, same time, same place. I will maybe have a couple leading discussion questions, but I really want to just sort of turn it over to y'all fine people and have a conversation about what you liked, what you found surprising, things you want to talk more about the book. I think you'll find as you get in here that there are some interesting parallels sort of between the way power and violence function in this text and the way that they continue to text today. I frequently thought of, I can sort of see some of these characteristics in contemporary political figures who we should probably leave unnamed at this point.
It all goes to power corrupts.
Yeah, and this is a nice way of getting to that same.